as the Dean mentioned, I'm a scholar of the Arab world, and for any of you who know about the Arab world, being a scholar of that region has long been a very depressing enterprise. For decades, the Arab world was talked of as the sick man of international politics. It's people mired in poverty and unfreedom and perhaps doomed to be forever so. Economies that once lagged behind Arab ones leapfrogged over them. So nobody was talking about anything like a Syrian miracle or the Arab tigers or the Egyptian model. Those Arab countries that actually did manage to achieve wealth seemed to do so only by having the good fortune to be situated atop great reservoirs of oil. And the only exports of the Arab world, in addition to that oil, seem to be problematic, difficult to assimilate immigrants, and a particular strain of violent millenarian radicalism that on September 11th dealt the US and I think the world economy a blow from which it has yet to fully recover. So it's particularly gratifying for somebody like me to be living in this particular moment in history in which people who might have viewed the Arab world solely as a domain of political and economic backwardness, of threats to Western culture and security, now find themselves enthralled and inspired by the great demonstrations of human courage and yearning for freedom that have gripped the Arab world since the beginning of the protests in Tunisia in December of last year. And when we talk about this inspirational effect of the so-called Arab Spring, I think we mean it quite literally. Ever since the Tunisian dictator Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali's night escape to Jeddah, or the resignation of Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak a little more than 3 weeks later, nearly every week has seemed to bring to us some news of some fresh protest in some new corner of the world that claims to take its inspiration from the Arab Spring. So if you go on the website, for example, of the Occupy Wall Street group, a movement which since last month has brought thousands of demonstrators to Lower Manhattan to demand the remediation of wealth inequality and the resultant imbalances in political power and voice, if you look at their website, it says, "We are using the revolutionary Arab Spring tactic to restore democracy in America." Last summer, we saw this Arab inspiration at work in what I think is a much more unlikely place, where hundreds of thousands of Israelis demonstrated in Tel Aviv and other cities. One of their slogans was, "The people demand social justice," a deliberate echo of the Arab Spring slogan, "Ash-sha'b yurid isqat an-nizam," the people demand the fall of the regime. There was a very popular photograph of a giant banner with the word irhal, or go, written in Arabic, and then under, in Hebrew, the words, "Egypt is coming." So a very clear kind of inspiration of the Arab Spring. Now elsewhere, we have movements of youth and movements of social justice that do not wear their Arab Spring inspirations quite as clearly on their sleeves, but nonetheless seem remarkably similar to what we saw in the Middle East. So in Chile, for example, hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets in recent months for a variety of causes. Students protesting the privatization of education, farmers protesting exchange rate policy, transport workers demonstrating for job security, gay rights campaigners demanding full equality, and similarly in Spain, you have the May 15th movement protests, which have encompassed similarly large numbers of people for equally capacious goals, from reforming the banking system to ending political patriarchy to demanding the establishment of fully participatory democracy. So we are clearly inhabiting a particular moment of history, and we want to try to understand what to make of it. Are these protests really all manifestations of a single phenomenon, or is our attribution of some common cause or features to these protests an example of a particular kind of cognitive bias that causes human beings to always see patterns where they actually don't exist? And if they are part of a single phenomenon, what precisely is the nature of that phenomenon? And when thinking about it, I think there's really two possibilities. So the first is that, and we've heard this a lot, is that what we're witnessing here is simply the power of digital media. That, and we've heard and read much about the Arab Spring and how various of the other protests we're here to think about are either Twitter or Facebook revolutions. And there's currently actually a not very interesting debate about whether or not, in fact, Twitter or Facebook or any of these other technologies can be said to have caused these revolutions. I don't think anybody serious really can claim that these tools had nothing to do with the revolutions. And so the relevant question is, what role would they have played? And there are, again, two possibilities. The first is that they just merely lowered the costs of collective action, that they made it easier for activists and organizers to plan and coordinate their activities. Now, this is not an insignificant thing, particularly in autocracies like Egypt and Tunisia, where repressive regimes invested considerable resources in stifling real-world activism. So when the Google executive, Reut wanted to organize a public event that would commemorate the murder of a young Alexandrian named Khaled Said at the hands of the police, but that he wanted something that would nonetheless not run afoul of the country's emergency law, which prevents gatherings, public gatherings of more than 5 people, he set up a Facebook page called We Are All Khaled Said and coordinated a silent vigil in which hundreds of people stood on the beach in Alexandria, dressed in black, none of them talking to each other, so it couldn't have been called a public gathering, and they just faced the sea. This was a demonstration of tremendous organizing power that had previously only resided in the hands of the state or in the hands of old established groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Now this kind of organizing power is available to 20-somethings with laptops. So that's one possibility, right? That the role of information technology was simply as a lowerer of collective action costs, as significant as that might be. The other possibility is that the information technology made possible something much deeper and more robust. That it did not simply lower the cost of collective action, but in fact, as my colleague Arkan Fung has posited, actually enabled the creation of a public sphere where citizens could gain information about their regimes, learn about the nature of its crimes, and also see firsthand the extent of popular dissatisfaction with it. So in this telling, these information technologies actually made it possible for people to engage in public deliberation over the problems facing their countries and thereby be transformed from ignorant to knowledgeable, from passive to active, and ultimately from subjects to citizens. So that's one set of things that I hope we'll talk about today, the role of information technology in these protests. But do the commonalities go deeper? Is it possible that people the world over are being animated by common grievances? Now, at first blush, it would seem hard to sustain this conclusion, given the diversity of political and economic contexts within which these protests are happening. The Egyptian and Tunisian protests, for example, were trying to democratize an authoritarian regime. The youth of Tahrir began with very clear demands: an end to corruption, torture, poverty, and unemployment, and they ended with an even clearer demand, which was the resignation of the President Hosni Mubarak. At no point could we have accused them of being vague. The Wall Street protesters, on the other hand, operate in the context of one of the world's most mature democracies, a political system that to the Egyptian activists today remains a kind of distant dream to which they could only aspire. Unlike the Egyptians, the US protesters have been repeatedly accused of lacking concrete demands, declaring only that they are the 99% and saying, we are our demands. And I've also already mentioned the equally broad nature of the Chilean and Spanish protesters. Nor does there seem to be a common economic underpinning to the protests, although on this I will, of course, defer to our much more knowledgeable panelists, about whom I'll say more in just a moment. The Spanish and Tunisian protests were led by young people, no doubt reeling from their country's very high rates of unemployment for people between the ages of 15 and 24. We have more than 30% youth unemployment in Tunisia, 43% in Spain. But if we look elsewhere, for example, in Chile, youth unemployment is high, but it's only around 18%, not that much higher than what you have here in the United States, and a lot lower than in many other European countries. And GDP grew at 6% last year. This was not necessarily a very dire case. And in any case, in neither of these places does youth employment seem to be the principal demand. If we looked at Egypt, for example, we'd see that one of the most interesting features of those protests were that its critical nuclei were formed not by the poor and disenfranchised and jobless, but by educated young people who might have been considered to be the winners under Mubarak's liberal economic reforms. So the scholar Sidney Tarrow has actually suggested recently that we're making a huge mistake if we try to locate a common policy goal of these movements, that what unites them is something much more basic, which he calls the desire to be recognized. These movements, he said, are declaring we are here, we must be included in the decision calculi of our leaders. At root, then, these protests may not be about bread, but rather about dignity. Their reactions fundamentally to the failure of political systems, be they democratic or autocratic, to adequately represent large portions of their citizens. Now, given this unusual nature of these movements, how are people in this room supposed to respond? How are business leaders and government officials supposed to deal with movements whose principal aim seems to be to establish their existence? It's not as if these protests can be satisfied by limited policy concessions, both because their demands do seem to be greater than that, and because they're so diverse. So, for example, if you want to alleviate youth unemployment by perhaps making it easier to hire people and lowering wage levels, you're almost certainly going to run afoul of unionized workers, who in many places are also parts of these movements. So given this, there may be a tendency on the part of people in this room to just wait the movements out, to hope that they will either confuse media attention for the fundamental recognition they seek, or that they'll simply succumb to fatigue, or that they'll fracture along lines of internal cleavage that inevitably emerge even within the most cohesive movements. And you'd have some reason for thinking this way. As Tarrow has pointed out, these kinds of we are here movements often fade away just as quickly as they got started. So in May in 1968, France was seized by a season of protests that involved more than 10 million workers and students. And that period in France has been repeatedly invoked of late as an analog to the current protests on Wall Street and elsewhere. Like the current protests, they were very broad in their demands, involving a wholesale critique of capitalism and the authoritarian relations it supposedly engenders. Now, leaving aside the fact that what happened in France dwarfs anything currently happening in the US or in the West, it's useful to recall how those protests ended. By the middle of June, a month later, calm had returned. The government of Charles de Gaulle, which had at the height of the protest appeared on the verge of collapse, won a major victory at the polls. Now it's actually very hard to read anything about the remarkable protests of 1968 that does not refer to them in some way as a failure. And it may yet prove to be the same with the Arab Spring. No one would dare say that the protests have failed, but I'm going to, or at least I'll say in a way that they have. The grand unified coalitions, the unseated dictators, have devolved quickly into orgies of bickering and finger-pointing, well before the fundamental task of building democratic institutions or extricating the military from public life has been completed. Yesterday I spoke with a dear Tunisian colleague who, during the Ben Ali period, constantly lamented the fact that Ben Ali had excluded the Islamists from participation in politics. And now, after the Islamists seem to have won 40% of the vote in elections to that country's constituent assembly, this self-same person is weeping bitter tears and using Ben Ali-type rhetoric about how the country is going to the dogs. We have the same thing in Egypt, where Islamists accuse liberals of wanting to strip Egypt of its values and identity, and liberals accuse Islamists of wanting to erect an Iranian-style theocracy, all the while the military consolidates its hold. So if this is the fate that befell the Arab Spring, then what of the movement of the 99? Assuming for a moment that Occupy Wall Street or other movements like it grow enough to render credible their claims to represent the underrepresented majority, surely that majority contains within it many multitudes who could probably not agree on much beyond this basic desire to be recognized. Now, though this may bring comfort to people who see in these movements only disruption and anarchy, I would conclude by saying it shouldn't, right? So though I began these remarks by saying how gratified I am that the Arab world has served as an inspiration for young people in the US and Europe and Latin America, the obverse of this is that we should probably despair at how dire the Western condition has become if it means that struggles by Arab youth against bloodthirsty tyrants aren't just seen as good things to be cheered on from afar, but rather seem to resonate very deeply with inhabitants of some of the world's oldest and most established democracies. So I will stop there, and I will tell you you're very lucky today that my thoughts on these questions of what causes these movements and where they're going and how to respond to them are not the last ones or even the best ones you'll hear today. Our organizers have put together, I think, a collection of really brilliant minds to help us think through this moment of history and what it means for our collective future. And I will introduce them not in the order in which they are sitting, nor even in the order in which they may choose to speak, although you may wish to coordinate on the order in which I introduce you. So the first is Dr. Isak Dwan, who's actually just joined the Kennedy School as a lecturer in public policy and the director of the Growth Lab for Africa and the Middle East at the Kennedy School's Center for International Development. Isak is unique in that he is both a cutting-edge economist who is nonetheless grounded in the realities of place. He has very deep knowledge of his native Arab world, but is also a very knowledgeable student of Africa who served as the World Bank country director in Ghana, Burkina Faso, and several other African countries. And he's just completed a very insightful piece on the underpinnings of the Arab Spring, the conclusions of which I hope he will share with us today. Isak is joined by Gidi Grinstein, who's the founder and president of the Reut Institute, which Thomas Friedman has called Israel's premier policy strategy group, and which seeks to strengthen what it sees as a weak political system unable to cope with the country's toughest challenges. Again, this theme of dissatisfaction with democracy seems to be emerging in lots of places. Gidi has worked the Israeli-Palestinian peace process under Prime Minister Ehud Barak and was a key participant in the 2000 Camp David summit that today I think remains the closest that Palestinians and Israelis have come to peace. More important than any of that, he's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. We're also pleased to welcome Dr. Florencia Torce, who is an associate professor of sociology at NYU and one of our leading experts on inequality. Her work examines the persistence and reproduction of social advantages across generations in such domains as wealth, education, and social mobility. And her most recent work sort of depressingly traces the emergence of disadvantages to the period spent in utero. So if you are lamenting your fate in life, realize that you never had a shot. A native of Chile, she has led several large data collection processes, and I think she will help us to put what's happening in Chile in this broader context. And finally, we're joined by Ethan Zuckerman, who directs the Center for Civic Media at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and who writes about and studies how digital media are changing political activism, journalism, and democracy more broadly. And I really can't think of anybody better placed to help us think about the role of information technology in catalyzing and sustaining this remarkable moment of activism we're living in now. He's been a longtime fellow of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard and was co-founder of Global Voices Online, which is this really incredible, I encourage you if you haven't checked it out to do so, it's this incredible community of more than 500 bloggers and translators who do this tremendous public service of identifying and relaying to us the best citizen journalism from around the world. He's also on the board of the Wikimedia Foundation. So please join me in welcoming them. So each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes, after which, depending on how much time we have left, we can open it up for a more general discussion. So who would like to go first? Ishac, I have you first. Do you want to?
Sure.
Home field advantage?
Sure. Should I go there?
And we can stay seated and do
Great.
this. It's your call.
Okay. All right. You're on?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. No? Yeah. All right. Great. Well, thank you, Tari. Very glad to be here with this panel, with all of you. I'm a bit jet lagged, just come from Cairo half an hour ago. And it's always confusing to go to Cairo. All the discussions were about the euro and the euro crisis. And I did make an effort to meet some politicians and some of the young revolutionaries that seem to have disappeared. And they are trying to think very hard like us in terms of what's happening in the rest of the world and what exactly have we started. The questions that I think we want to think about is why is it that the Arab revolutions, the awakening, took so long to happen? And then why is it that it happened like it happened in Tunisia first and in Egypt, and not in some of the poorest countries? And then why is it that it spread? These are all difficult questions. I mean, we got all very, I'm sure, like me, you were glued to the TV and excited by all that was happening. And of course, when it's happening, it feels normal, that it had to happen. But it is, after all, quite surprising. And I think to try to understand the character of this revolution can really help us understand what is happening elsewhere as well. My own work takes the view that the autocracies, the Middle Eastern autocracies, the Arab autocracies have really changed in the 90s. And initially they were modernist and driven by building society, modernizing the state, until the mid-80s. But then slowly their nature changed, and they became increasingly, the bargain increasingly became to protect the liberal tradition, the modernist tradition, from political Islam. And we've been in that kind of regime in the past 20 years. And what has changed recently is that some of the main beneficiaries of that regime, young liberals, as Tariq said, educated youth, decided that they don't want this bargain anymore, and they shifted their support. And so it's really the insiders that rebelled, as opposed to where we were all waiting for the rebellion to come from, which was from political Islam, which really concentrated all the opposition against that mode of governance in the past many years. So I think this is the main theme that I want to keep in mind when I tell you about some of the characteristics of the character of those revolutions. So the first one is indeed that it was led by these insiders that were unhappy with the corruption, were unhappy with what they call dignity, the difference between their views of the world, their views about what would be good to society and what they were observing in society. And it was leaderless. It was in a way spontaneous. The fact of being in Tahrir Square with the communication attracted other people, and it was that presence that actually made the revolution. That presence of the liberals isolated the dictator, and so it didn't actually require known leaders. And indeed, once the act was done, the leaders dissolved and are hard to find. Now we are back into politics, and indeed into electoral politics. The field is very divided. But what has happened is actually extremely revolutionary. It is a change of regime from one where there is an alliance between the autocrats and the liberals against political Islam, who is trying to take over in a violent manner, to a different political settlement where the liberals have managed to regroup and to say, no, we will actually trust the rest of society, enter into a conversation with them, and by this flight of imagination, if you like, reject a system and seek another system which we don't know where it's going to take us. I think that characteristic of the movement is extremely important, because it is also the characteristic that we see in Wall Street, a rejection of a system by, after all, the insiders, the youth, the educated, and it's a flight of imagination that's taking us, we don't know where, but there's a trust that there is enough social capital in society to be able to deal with those questions. And another aspect is the dynamic of those revolutions. And I think that's another similarity. We didn't see them coming out of a series of riots and rebellions, but rather it was, they came after a period of riches. in the countries, the better off countries of the Middle East, Tunisia and Egypt, a period of riches where the governments have been very lavish in giving subsidies to those classes. A third of the budget in Egypt and about a third of the budget in Tunisia goes to subsidies for energy and other commodities that go to the better off. And so what this reflects is the exhaustion of a system. And therefore, a system that has tried to seduce, to continue to seduce that group into a particular order, being rejected by those beneficiaries at the moment where the regime appears basically exhausted, having delivered all they can. And at the same time, the perception that what is on the other side, this mysterious and unknown future, is not as threatening as one is led to believe by the attempt to radicalize, to divide. That was the characteristic of the autocrat. Perhaps a third characteristic, which is very special to the Middle East, is that the dictators took it all on their back. In a way, killing them was like killing the Freudian father. The repression of political Islam, the bringing of difficult economic reforms, difficult external positions relative to Israel, for example, in Egypt, that were not popular. And so the rebellion was very clearly against that father dictator. I think Wall Street is a bit more difficult because the problems that the demonstrators are dealing with are much more diffused. Perhaps what got them concentrated and the parallelism here is the financial crisis, which is a focal point. The contagion is another aspect, which in the Arab world I would explain by the fact that this equation shifted at the same time everywhere. Political Islam is a regional phenomenon. Its moderation is regional, and on the other hand, what is being rejected, which is corruption, is also a certain way of doing business, which is also regional. So, all in all, it would be really interesting to hear from others about what the anti-globalization movement are telling us. My own impression is that in methods, we have something very similar, but perhaps in terms of the content and the focus, something quite different. Maybe the Arabs were, or have been so far, luckier because the goal has been much clearer. The goal, at least in the initial phase, was simply to change the regime and to move away from that particular autocratic order. The difficult part comes now, where all the problems of low growth, of jobless growth, of the youth bulge needs to be resolved. Now, I think the particular moment right now is one of divisions because the movement is confronted by elections. Yesterday, of course, the news of the peaceful elections from Tunisia were received in Cairo with a lot of hope and joy, indeed, because they came at a moment where the mood is pretty low, as it was very low 2 weeks ago in Tunisia as well. But the fact that we are already moving in Tunisia to a situation where, a historical situation where liberals, middle class, youth, and political Islam make party representatives sit at the same table and start debating the problems of their society is absolutely a unique moment. Thank you.
So, Gidi.